All right. So now that you took a couple minutes to journal, your responses to the questions, how would you define empathy and vulnerability? And how have you built these definitions up for yourself from the messages that you've been given about empathy and vulnerability and any possible connection between the two? And you've taken that and you've balanced it with this resource from the shelf, Brene Brown's Embracing Vulnerability talk, right? Where Brown makes this connection between empathy and vulnerability. What does it mean for you to balance those two? And to offer a third weight to the balance of what you were taught, what Brene Brown says, and what we're thinking here with our Education 251 teaching team, here's a little pathway for you to consider, right? So Brene Brown talks about this idea that you can't be truly empathetic unless you're willing to be vulnerable, right? And I don't have a problem agreeing with that. For myself in my own life, I've been taught the American idiom for as long as I can remember that to be empathetic is to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, right? And that makes sense to me. And there's this other idiom that goes along with that, right? Which is how many of you have ever been in a situation in your life where somebody says to you, without you asking, well, if I was in your shoes, I would, right? They give you advice that you're not even looking for, right? So it's funny because they're saying, if I was in your shoes, and there's that saying about empathy, which is to empathize with someone is to walk a mile in their shoes. So this person who's saying, well, if I were in your shoes, I would do this or that. Are they being empathetic? Possibly. Are they willing to empathize with me? And the root words of empathies is to suffer in or to struggle in, sorry, to struggle in, right? Are they entering the struggle with me? And generally, when somebody says, well, if I was in your shoes, I would, they're not struggling with me. They think the answer is easy or obvious, right? They're giving me advice that I haven't sought. Now, it's different if I ask somebody for advice, hey, what would you do in the situation? And they said, well, if I were in your shoes, I would blah, 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 blah. And they're saying that because I asked them to. They're entering into what I've asked them to, right? So authentic empathy needs to be vulnerable. The person needs to be willing to get into the struggle, into the struggle. That is literally what empathy means, in the struggle with you, right? So now here's, though, where I start to run out of the ability to mirror what Brown is saying. So Brown talks about empathizing with her daughter, right? The middle schooler, who Brown remembers the time when she was in middle school, and she uses that to connect with her middle school daughter. So how possible is it then for me to say, for our teaching team to say to you all as undergrads, we know exactly what it's like to be in your shoes because we were undergrads too. We all struggled. We all suffered as undergrads through various difficult situations. If I said, I know what it's like to be an undergrad, you'd probably say, sure, you were an undergrad once. I'd hope that you'd believe me. I hope that you would believe us. But it doesn't mean that we completely understand what it's like. And in fact, here's where we want to offer another form of vulnerability, not just empathetic vulnerability, but actually radical vulnerability. We want to say that there will be times in this quarter, especially when somebody is a window for you, not a mirror, right? That's the thing with empathy, is empathetic vulnerability generally means that you have to have a mirrored experience of somebody else. If somebody is a window for you, though, you might have to acknowledge the radical difference between your experience and that person's experience and say, I have no idea what it is that you're talking about, but I'm here to hear and listen to you and believe you. Let me give you an example of that, right? So for me, I've been a thrifty person most of my life. Most of my clothes are either free or I get them from Costco. Generally speaking, if I were in front of you right now in class, I'd be wearing a collared shirt, Kirkland brand slacks, shoes on sale from Costco, right? And I'd say, look, I know a bunch of you also shop at Costco or have formerly shopped at Costco, and you could look me up and down right now and judge me, evaluate me. You could figure out that my whole outfit is worth 80 bucks, right, at Costco. And some of you might judge me for that. And so I can say, see, look, I know exactly what it's like to be judged for my clothes, to be objectified for my outfit. And some of you are thinking to yourselves, I understand that experience from a social class perspective. You know, and you've been evaluated for how expensive your clothes are or how many people had your clothes before you. But others of you are thinking from a gender-based perspective. And you're thinking to yourself, oh, John Doe, as a cisgender man, you might know what it's like for people to check out your clothing, your outfit for how expensive your clothes were, or for maybe even how often you work out at the gym. But you've never known the experience of someone who's trans or femme, who's been objectified and had to worry for their safety, had to worry for their well-being. And in that moment, instead of saying, no, I totally know because I know people have looked at my clothing and have evaluated my body before, I know exactly what it's like. I'm in that situation sounding closer to that fake empathy situation where I'm insisting, I'm forcing myself into your shoes, saying I've been there before, when in fact I haven't. So in this class, hopefully there will be times where we can practice empathetic vulnerability with the folks whose experience is that we mirror and that we've had the same experiences that they've had, and we can share in common bonds. Our teaching team, we've all been undergrads. So to a certain extent, we can understand what it is to be an undergrad. And we also will have opportunities to practice radical vulnerability, where we don't pretend like we know everything about your experience, your lived experience with your various identities and the situations in your life. And so we will allow for the truth of your story. We won't judge it. We won't question it as not possibly being true. We will hear you, especially if you're speaking a truth from an identity that is systemically and socially targeted, minoritized. And we'll talk more about that this quarter. So take a moment to think, what does it mean for you to be empathetic, for you to be vulnerable, for you to be empathetically vulnerable, in the words of Brene Brown, and for you to be radically vulnerable, in the words of our Education 251 teaching team? If you have some thoughts or questions about this, you can go ahead to the Week 1B module, where we have the difference between empathetic and radical vulnerability, and you can add your questions or thoughts there.